Welcome to the Korea Economic Institute of America and our quite timely program today dealing with security in the Korean Peninsula. Let me turn this over to Troy Stanglerone, our Senior Director and Director of Congressional Affairs. Troy?
Thank you, Congressman Mazzullo, and thank you all for being here today. As you all know, we've had sort of an interesting week over the last week or so with President Trump canceling the June 12th summit. Now it looks as though the summit will be back on. But as part of this whole process, one of the issues that has come out has been what is the sort of role of the United States forces in South Korea and what is the future of that role? And it's something that we wanted to take and discuss today. And we're very fortunate today to have David Maxwell and Frank with us here. Both have extensive experience working either in the U.S. military, serving in South Korea, or at the Department of Defense working on these issues. So just very briefly, you have the bios, but Frank to my immediate right, is a senior expert on North Korea at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Prior to joining USIP, he was a visiting scholar at the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins. From 2010 to 2017, he served as a senior advisor for North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Next to him is David Maxwell, who is a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Army. He retired as Special Forces Colonel. He served 20 years in Asia, primarily in Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. He also served on the United Nations Command, the Combined Forces Command, and U.S. Forces Korea CJ3 staff, where he was a planner for the UNC CFC Op Plan 5072-98. I might need to let you say what that actually means because that's a lot of acronyms right there. But needless to say, both of them have extensive experience dealing in this issue. Before we move, though, directly into the whole situation, looking at U.S. forces in South Korea, I want to talk about the situation where we kind of are now briefly, because I feel like we need to, with everything going on, put it in context. As I mentioned, it looks like the summit might be on. What do you think, in terms of, maybe we'll start with you, Frank, where we are right now in terms of the process? Do you think the summit will happen, and do you think that, we're in a good place for that?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me here. We haven't received official confirmation that the summit is happening at all or on June 12th, but all the remarks and words we're getting from the White House, from South Korea, from North Korea, seems to suggest that there are preparations occurring right now that would put a summit on track for June 12th, or at least sometime shortly after. So I think it seems to be on the way. A lot of people have criticized the preparation, saying that normally it's a lot of lower level meetings that happen first, and then you culminate in a senior level meeting or a summit. I see the value in that. At the same time, I think what makes this situation unique is the fact that President Trump is willing to meet with Kim Jong-un very quickly. And now at this point, because you've had Mike Pompeo meet with Kim Jong-un twice, and looks like there's going to be a third meeting, at least between Kim Young-chul and Mike Pompeo. You have the Ambassador Sung Kim meetings occurring right now. You have the logistics meeting between Joe Hagan and Kim Chang-sun. You have a lot of inter-Korean meetings, the Xi Jinping, Kim Jong, there's been a lot of meetings. And so, sure, this has all been rushed, but I think we've been talking about North Korea issues for the last 25 years. It's not a matter of preparation at this point. It's really a matter of political will.
So, Dave, the North Koreans a couple weeks ago were essentially saying that they wouldn't potentially denuclearize. Do you think there's the political will on the North Korean side to denuclearize? And even on the U.S. side, do you think there's the political will to do the things we'll need to do?
Well, I think the use of the word denuclearize is a problem. And I think that, as we've heard, first of all, to echo everything Frank said, to borrow from Churchill, it's better to jaw than war. And I think the last, really since January 1st through the Olympics, certainly with the 27 April North-South meeting and all the contacts in this very compressed timeline, I think is a good thing. And I think that regardless of what happens on June 12th, whether it happens or not, or whatever the outcome is, I think that the idea that we're talking is a good thing. Now, I also think, though, that Kim Jong-un is getting just what he wants. He's arriving on the world stage. That 27 April meeting, he turned out to be a fairly media savvy, operator. And I think, he changed a lot of people's opinions, particularly in the South, and how he handled himself, both he and President Moon. I mean, they orchestrated probably the best made-for-TV diplomatic event. But will North Korea dismantle its nuclear weapons program? That your guess is as good as mine. Everything we have studied up until this point, we believe that North Korea's nuclear program is key to regime survival, key to its unification plans, key to its blackmail diplomacy. So it's hard to see whether it will give up its nuclear program for anything. But I think it's really important that President Trump and Kim Jong-un come to some kind of agreement on what they mean by denuclearization. And of course, we believe that from Kim Jong-un's point of view, denuclearization is of the entire peninsula, a nuclear weapons-free zone, which of course means an end to the ROK-U.S. alliance, an end to U.S. forces presence on the peninsula, an end to the nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence, because that is what threatens the North. And so, and I think that perspective from Kim Jong-un is always going to give him a trump card. He's going to have an out in any negotiations, because if we're unwilling to do that, and I believe we should be unwilling to end the alliance in any situation, then he will always have a way out, because he will be able to say, if we don't follow his concept of denuclearization, then we won't get CVID for North Korea.
I would just add there that I agree that very skeptical about Kim Jong-un's willingness to denuclearize, but I do feel he's serious about being willing to go down the path of denuclearization to at least see what sorts of benefits and incentives he can extract along the way. And if that's what we have to deal with, to go down this path of diplomatic engagement, I think it's worthwhile.
And I'd agree with that. I think that is one path, but the alternate path is that he is going to go down the other path, where he will see how much he can get and never take any substantive action, which is similar to what we've seen for the past couple decades.
Well, so before we move, to the specifics of U.S. forces in South Korea, one question I have, and maybe we'll start with you, Frank, but then Dave, I want your thoughts as well. If let's work from the premise that the summit happens, that they have some kind of framework or declaration that they announce, beyond just the definition, because you mentioned that, of denuclearization, to make sure that we're all on the same page, are there any other sort of key things that you would like to see in that, to know that we're in a good place?
I think having some sort of joint communique or declaration after the summit that says, at a minimum, that North Korea is committed to denuclearization, and it may be just very broad like that without any specifics, but their commitment to denuclearization, as well as a U.S. commitment to addressing North Korea's concerns, maybe even going far as being willing to think about a peace regime process, as well as some sort of broad roadmap, as well as a timeline for the next senior level meeting. I think if you have those components, that'd be a successful meeting.
Okay. Yeah, I concur with Frank. I just a little bit finer point on it. I would like to see coming out of it, I think the best case, I don't think there'll be a grand bargain. I don't think we're going to see any kind of big commitment. But I think, to add to what Frank said, I'd like to see both President Trump and Kim Jong-un agree to allow their diplomats, the experts, to come together and develop that roadmap. I don't think they'll have a roadmap completed by the time of the summit on the 12th or thereabouts, and I don't think they'll create one at that time. But I think an agreement to allow the experts to work on a roadmap, and then a time frame to meet again in 3 months or 6 months, and to continue the process. To me, that would be not a success, but it would be a good outcome, and putting us on a path, on a diplomatic path that that we have to test. We have to continue to test, and ultimately, get into the verification aspect.
I would add that, so that's sort of the bare minimum. If there are additional things that could be announced, that's even better. And so, for example, there's the travel ban that prevents U.S. citizens going to North Korea, except journalists and Red Cross. But that is a ban that needs to be renewed, I think, later this year. And so maybe an announcement saying that that ban will not be renewed, or some statement from North Korea about a nuclear missile production freeze, or things like that that are very doable, or maybe a security guarantee, something that addresses the participation of strategic nuclear assets. Those are things that are all very doable, but also very reversible. And so it doesn't commit any side to do something for the long term if the other side doesn't act up.
Okay. So now I'd like to move to, the United States presence in South Korea. When we think about U.S. forces in South Korea, Frank, how would you describe the actual role of our troop presence there, and what really today is their mission?
So the primary, and Dave will have great stuff to say about this too since he served, but the primary role is to deter external aggression, talking specifically about North Korea. So there's the deterrence role. And then the flip side is also reassurance. We are there in Korea to reassure our allies, South Korean allies, but also our Japanese allies, about our commitment to defend South Korea against a North Korean attack. Our troops there basically serve as a tripwire so that in the case of an attack, the U.S. is automatically involved. And I think also given the relatively small size of our force presence, 20,500 troops, relative to the over 600,000 South Korean troops, that a special role for the U.S. forces is to fill in the gaps of South Korean capabilities. So things like command and control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, missile defense, things that the South Korean capabilities haven't been able to mature as quickly on. And then, of course, if deterrence fails, then we have to defend South Korea against North Korean attack. And to do so effectively, we need to have been there conducting military exercises so that we build up our interoperability, build trust and coordination, all the things that need to have been done way in advance before a contingency scenario occurs. And then the last part I would add is that we also have to look at the force presence in Korea in the context of our strategic security in the region and our global force posture. And so anything that we can do to, I guess that all depends on the security environment in the region and how the forces on the peninsula provide the flexibility for our posture globally.
So, Dave, one of the things that is sort of, unique, not necessarily unique about this relationship, but that is a key part of this relationship is we have a mutual defense treaty. It actually predates our mutual defense treaty with Japan. How does our mutual defense treaty with South Korea specifically work, and what obligations does it place on the United States and South Korea?
Well, that's a great question. First, I'd echo everything that Frank had said, but I'd make one slight adjustment to that. Our forces don't necessarily fill in the gaps of Korean forces. The way the alliance has evolved, both nations have developed capabilities that contribute to the alliance. And because of that, each country hasn't had to develop certain other capabilities. So it's less about gaps, but more about optimizing the capabilities of both the ROK and U.S. militaries to defend the Republic of Korea. But I think it's interesting to note in the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty that there are two words not used in the treaty. And those are North Korea. Or four words, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Specifically, the treaty says desiring to publicly declare and formally their common determination to defend themselves against external armed attack so that no potential aggressor could be under the illusion that either of them stands alone in the Pacific area. And desiring further to strengthen their efforts for collective defense, for the preservation of peace and security, pending the development of a more comprehensive and effective system of regional security in the Pacific area. That's from the preamble there, and there's really 6 short articles. It's less than 2 pages is the entire treaty, but it is to defend the South against external aggression. It talks about the Pacific area, and those words, the preservation of peace and security pending the development of a more comprehensive and effective system, I think you could interpret that, an eventual peace treaty, peace agreement. And of course, if you look at the 1953 armistice that was signed, which only suspended the hostilities, paragraph 60 of the armistice, which was an agreement between military leaders on the North side and on the UN side, paragraph 60 calls on all political parties to come together to solve the Korea question, and within 90 days. In fact, those are what the words are. And of course, the Korea question is what? That's the unnatural division of the Korean Peninsula. So the military leaders in 1953 recognized that there has to be a political solution. And so they temporarily suspended hostilities so that the political leaders could do that. And of course, now seven decades later, we still don't have that political solution.
I'd also add that this binding obligation also falls on the ROK side as well. And so ROK forces have been involved in defense of U.S. missions, including the Iraq War, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, and a whole host of other operations around the world.
So when I started, my opening remarks, I talked about, there's these questions been raised about the future of U.S. forces in South Korea. But one of the things that, I think sometimes maybe people don't realize is that, the nature of our relationship has changed over the years. And, one of the things I'd like to specifically talk about is, since the Roh Moo-hyun administration, we've been, basically discussing how to take and transfer wartime operational control to South Korea. So maybe, Dave, I'll start with you. If you could maybe tell us a little bit about how the current command structure works and sort of like what this relationship change would mean.
Yeah, this is the most complex issue. Command and control in Korea is very, very complex, and I'll do my best to try to simplify it. So there are three major commands in Korea. The United Nations Command, which of course was established by UN Security Council resolutions 82, 83, 84, and 85 at the beginning of the Korean War, and that has existed since the Korean War. It was in 1978 that with the development of the ROK economy, the ROK society, and the ROK military, that the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command was established. And that is a bilateral command that is now responsible for deterrence of an attack, and if deterrence fails, defeating an attack and winning the war, and supporting the ultimate answer to the Korea question. U.S. Forces Korea is what we call in the military a subunified command, and it actually belongs to the Pacific Commander in Hawaii. And it has a very simple mission. It provides forces to the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. Okay, it is what we call a force provider. U.S. Forces Korea has no command or control over any ROK forces, and it only is really an administrative headquarters to provide those warfighting elements to the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. On the Korean side, you have the ROK Joint Chiefs of Staff, which controls all of the entire ROK military. And when the decisions are made by the President of Korea and the President of the United States, in conjunction with their Minister and Secretary of Defense, they will provide forces, Korean forces and U.S. forces, to the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command in order to fight a war if necessary, or raise the readiness level to be prepared to meet any threat. And so the ROK JCS and U.S. Forces Korea provide forces. Now, General Brooks, as the commander of the UN Command, as commander of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, and commander of U.S. Forces Korea, he wears a fourth hat as a member of the military committee. He has a very complex job. And of course, it's very confusing to all of us. And those of you in Korea will know that generally the press will always talk about USFK, U.S. Forces Korea. But as I said, that has no role over ROK military forces. It is the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. And as the commander, General Brooks answers to the military committee. And the military committee is made up of representatives of the national command and military authorities from both countries. Both chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the PACOM commander, the Minister of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, and General Brooks. And they, together, those Korean and U.S. military officers and civilian leaders, determine the actions of the ROK-U.S. Combined Forces Command. And in effect, and General Brooks will say this publicly, that he answers equally to both presidents as the ROK-U.S. Combined Forces Command commander. Now, as the United Nations Command commander, he answers to General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because the United Nations made the United States the executive agent of the United Nations Command. And so he reports to General Dunford as the United Nations Command commander. And as the U.S. Forces Korea commander, he reports to Admiral Harris up until this week. And I think change of command happens in the next couple days. So he works for multiple commanders, multiple leaders, but he worked as the warfighting commander of the ROK-U.S. Combined Forces Command. He answers equally to both Korea and the U.S. Now, OPCON transfer started initiated in January of 2003, right after the election of Roh Moo-hyun, and really initiated by Secretary Rumsfeld. And as you recall, the time frame after the Highway 56 incident, the election of Roh Moo-hyun, and Secretary Rumsfeld's desire to be able to use all forces, U.S. military forces, in the war on terrorism, suggested to the Koreans that they change OPCON, move U.S. forces out of Yongsan to the south, and so that he could use U.S. forces in other areas outside of Korea. And that started on this long process of the OPCON transfer. And the OPCON transfer was predicated on the ROK government investing in military capabilities to provide the ROK military with independent warfighting capabilities. As Frank mentioned, the gaps, as I would say, how the alliance was optimized. When you split the ROK-U.S. Combined Forces Command, it is going to be like splitting Siamese twins. It is so integrated and so, the interoperability between the ROK and U.S. forces is so great that you're going to have to split the baby. And it's going to be, and it's proven to be, very expensive for the ROK government to develop the counterfire capabilities, the C4I capabilities, the advanced precision weapons capabilities. There were 10 major areas that the ROK government had to invest in, while simultaneously the ROK government contributing to the burden sharing of U.S. forces in Korea and moving U.S. forces south to Camp Humphreys, to what is now the largest U.S. military base outside the United States and maybe the largest U.S. military base, which of course cost about $10.7 billion, and the ROK government contributed 92% of that funding. So invest in military capabilities for independent warfighting capabilities and support the burden sharing and the movement of U.S. forces south. That put a lot of pressure on the ROK government, and of course that is what has delayed the OPCON transfer, and ultimately in 2015 they determined to make it condition-based. And of course we've just heard from the Secretary or the Minister of Defense saying that by 2023 there will be a new combined command with a Korean general in charge and a U.S. deputy commander, and that will ultimately be the end result of OPCON transfer. But in the end, there won't be any OPCON transfer because that new command will still have to answer equally to the military committee. And just as there are now no U.S. forces or no Korean forces under the control of the U.S. government, even in the new construct, there won't be any U.S. forces under the control of the Korean government. We'll still answer to the military committee just as it does now. And so there will be no sovereignty issues, no national emotional issues, or there should not be on the U.S. side, just as there should not be on the Korean side now, although, of course, there are.
The only thing I would add there is that the two countries agreed to accelerate the OPCON transition by, you said 2023. That being said, there are still conditions that are involved. And two of them are the ROK developing the critical military capabilities and the advanced capabilities that are necessary to assume the lead of the warfight. And so we've seen the ROK taking these steps, the upgrade of PAC-2 to PAC-3s in missile defense, their acquisition of F-35s, the 4 Global Hawk, which is the ISR. So the ROKs are taking the steps to fill in these gaps and give themselves more confidence to take the lead.
But I would argue that as long as there is a combined command, as there is now, that then we can move forward. And I think that my biggest fear, and during this whole process from 2003 until just recently, the concept was to have two separate commands. ROK JCS would control ROK forces, and there would be a separate U.S. Korea command, and they would coordinate. And as all military personnel know, that is a violation of the fundamental principle of war of unity of command. And so having separate commands is not the way to go. And as Frank said, we have developed this combined command that is more interoperable and works together better than any other international coalition command in the world. And it is the envy of other countries. Other countries would like to have the same kind of relationship, military relationship, as the Korean military and the U.S. military. So I am confident that in 2023, if we can sustain a combined command and there's a Korean general in charge, we will be just fine and able to execute the alliance responsibilities of deterrence, and if deterrence fails, defending, fighting, and winning.
So, Frank, moving to the future, be it 2023 or even maybe closer, one of the issues that comes up that's often discussed is that, if North Korea is no longer a threat, is there really a purpose for U.S. troops in South Korea? So I'm curious, you've talked a little bit about sort of the roles that South Korea has played in some U.S. missions. Is our relationship really so basic as that North Korea is the entire focus, or has the relationship sort of evolved beyond that over the last 60 years or so?
Right. So like I said before, again, the primary mission has been to deter and defend against external attack, meaning North Korea. But there's also missions that focus on the regional security environment as well as the global security environment. And you have instances where U.S. troops that are in South Korea will leave the peninsula for a bit, again, under the framework of force management or strategic stability that allows the flexibility for U.S. forces to serve in any global mission. So, yeah, I wouldn't say it's just the basic mission of defending against North Korean threat. It has evolved over the last, however many decades of the U.S. ROK alliance.
And if I could add on to that, I think if there is a peace regime, a settlement to the Korean War, even if there's unification, we have to ask the fundamental questions, and questions we should be continually asking. And that is really, what do we, as the U.S., want to achieve on the Korean Peninsula? Fundamentally, what are our interests? What's the acceptable, durable political arrangement on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia that's going to support U.S. and Korean interests, alliance interests? And as I said, and as Frank alludes to, the Mutual Defense Treaty is not just about North Korea. It is a treaty between the ROK and the U.S. That is for mutual security. And so whatever evolves on the Korean Peninsula, then we need to ask ourselves, what are our interests? What are our combined interests? And then specifically for the military perspective of that, if we understand what those interests are, what those goals and objectives, what our strategy is, then we ask the question, how do we organize U.S. and ROK forces to support those political objectives? And that's something that I think is really important, and something that we have to also continue to do. And that's why we've seen the military alliance evolve, over the last 7 decades. And we should not be afraid to evolve in the alliance, to change force structure. But one thing that I do caution, Frank brought up 28,500 people. We've heard Congress talk about passing a law establishing a floor of 22,000 people. As a military person, counting soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines really doesn't help me. What are the capabilities? I mean, really, if we had 22,000 cooks on the peninsula, I don't know if that would really help us in fighting a war, although it may be necessary to feed the people in the north. But, on a serious note, rather than talk about pure troop numbers, we should be talking about capabilities. And as we talk about capabilities, command, control, communications, intelligence, logistics. As Frank said, very few of our forces are combat forces. We have one ground combat brigade on the Korean Peninsula, and there's about 35 ROK divisions, with about 3 brigades each, which is about 105 brigade combat teams to our 1 brigade combat team. Compare those numbers. But what we are prepared to do is have the logistics and the capability to reinforce the peninsula. And that's what a large amount of our forces are there for, is to be able to bring reinforcements from the region and from the United States.
I would just add that you're talking about the troop numbers. So you have to remember that the presence isn't a static issue. So we had over 70,000 troops in South Korea after the Korean War, and then slowly it was drawn down from 60,000 to 40,000, and now we're at 20,500. So if you're asking a question, sort of a hypothetical scenario of peace on the peninsula and what that would mean for U.S. force presence, I think one question is, it depends on what type of peace we're talking about. Is it a tenuous peace? Is it sort of early in the process? Is Kim Jong-un still in power? Does he still have weapons of mass destruction? What would our role and mission be? I think if in that case, you would still have a very strong rationale for keeping troops on the peninsula. If you're further down the road and the peace seems more sustainable, maybe you've gone 10, 20 years without a major provocation, maybe North Korea is pursuing the path of economic and political liberalization. In that case, I think there's a rationale for some sort of drawdown. Again, I think people tend to see it in the white and black, like sort of the current presence on the peninsula or complete withdrawal and removal. I think there's many different gradations, and it all depends on, as David said, what function and role that the forces are serving.
Well, and I kind of want to dig into this a little bit more. So for the sake of argument, let's say, because there's a story this morning in the New York Times, Sig Hecker said that it could take 15 years to denuclearize North Korea. I think at a minimum, both of us were at an event David Albright did. He said the HEU program, I think it was 36 months to do. So, regardless of what happens at the summit, this isn't going to happen tomorrow. So in that sense, we know that basically the picture going forward, even if there's improving relations, strategically is going to look fairly similar. In that environment, are there, force structure changes that just make sense regardless, things that where, we should take and move forward and maybe, improve the air presence or something, or any things of that nature we should be considering?
Yes, and I think our military planners continuously do assess that and try to determine what we need to do. If it takes 15 years to denuclearize, yes, I think that we have to, or dismantle, I hate to use the word denuclearize, but if it takes 15 years to dismantle their nuclear program, I'm not just concerned with their nuclear program, though. They have chemical, biological, but they also have 1.2 million man army. I'm still concerned about miscalculation. I'm still concerned, I think we're making an assumption that Kim Jong-un has totally given up his strategy that the Kim family regime has had for the last 7 decades, and I think that needs to be tested. And I would not make an assumption that he has given up that strategy until it is thoroughly tested. And so the presence of U.S. forces combined with the ROK military still provides a deterrent effect. And I think that we have to be prepared for potential miscalculation until the confidence-building measures for North Korea's conventional forces are implemented, pulling back from the DMZ, artillery out of the Quezon Heights that ranges Seoul. And until those actions are taken, we have to continue to make sure that our forces are ready and that we have the right forces in place to deter and defend.
So, but just Dave, to sort of, pull this point out a little bit more, it's not just a question of even what the U.S. force structure is, it's the question of the North Korean force structure more broadly as well, not just the nuclear side of the program.
Absolutely, and I think we have to continually assess their capabilities and intentions, which, of course, intentions are the hardest thing to assess, and so I am not willing to gamble, with U.S. interests on the peninsula or with the lives of 50 million Koreans living in the South either. I still think that it is in our interest to prevent war on the Korean Peninsula. And I think we should all agree that we do not want war to happen. I just happen to think that the best way to deter war is a strong ROK-U.S. Combined military capability.
So I want to move to open the audience up to questions here in a couple minutes, and I'll maybe start with you, Frank. I want to sort of get into the question of, if we have, troop drawdown for the sake of troop drawdown rather than for the strategic situation, how does that impact then our ability to, defend South Korea if something happens, Japan, or even work more widely in the region?
Yeah, I'll just try to be brief to get to the questions, but I think one of the biggest disadvantages is that you lose that tripwire. So I guess it all depends on how the restructuring is done. But if you don't have the U.S. force presence there, then the deterrence elements is severely diminished. In terms of our force posture in Japan, again, we share the same security threats and concerns with our Japanese allies, and so what happens in North Korea will not only affect our presence in Korea, but also in Japan. And again, because of the UNC rear bases in Japan and the function it plays in facilitating the flow of forces into Korea, I think that will be affected as well.
And you have to take a holistic approach, as Frank is saying. I mean, the 7 United Nations designated bases in Japan are critical to supporting any kind of contingency on the Korean Peninsula. And so you've got to look at a regional approach. I mean, the 7th Fleet, both in the Pacific Air Force, all of those forces that are in the region have to be looked at. But I'd push back a little bit on tripwire. There are very few forces there are no forces on the DMZ. No U.S. forces on the DMZ. The DMZ is defended by the Korean military. And except for a small element in Panmunjom, the Joint Security Battalion, there are no U.S. forces on the DMZ. And as we move the combat forces down to Camp Humphreys, they're going to be out of normal artillery range. And so, as a tripwire, we all think that U.S. forces are on the DMZ and will be the first shots fired. Now, the first shots may occur at Osan Air Base and Kunsan Air Base with missile attacks and everything. But the point I want to make is that I think there's a bigger tripwire than the U.S. military. And that's the presence of U.S. civilians and not military dependence, but the interconnectedness of Korea and the United States economically, multinational corporations. There is a large civilian U.S. presence and international presence in South Korea because of the stature of Korean society, Korean economy, that to me, we have a large U.S. civilian presence in South Korea that is under the threat of North Korean artillery. And so to me, that I would include that in any kind of tripwire discussion. And we just can't disengage. I mean, think about it. We could pull the military out. If South Korea decided that they did not want a U.S. military presence, we would pull that out, pull out our forces. But we could not make our civilians go home, if they're engaged in economic commerce and the like there. So I think our civilian presence in South Korea is very large, and that too is part of any kind of tripwire.
And I think, when you look at be it the Gulf War, be it Afghanistan or something, any of the recent conflicts the U.S. has been in, this is something about Korea that's uniquely different. Some members of Congress have said the phrase essentially, if there's a conflict, it'll happen over there rather than over here. But there's such a large U.S. presence in South Korea itself that in some ways the conflict happens here regardless of whether we want it to or not because of that.
Well, and a conflict there is going to have global impacts. I mean, Korea is the shrimp among whales. That peninsula is surrounded by, the second and third largest economy in the world, China and Japan. You've got Russia to the north. If something happens on the Korean Peninsula, whether it's war, regime collapse, instability, it is going to have global effects because, Korea is between the 8th and 11th largest economy. So Korea is kind of like a focal point for Northeast Asia. And what happens there is going to have global effects. So I think it's in all of our interest to be concerned with the security of the Korean Peninsula.
I think Korea is becoming more like the tuna among whales, maybe, rather than the shrimp. But so just real quick, Frank, to sort of put this on the U.S. side of things, if we were to take and draw troops down, and because we're talking about burden sharing now, and clearly that's an issue, where would a reduction of U.S. troops go, and what would the likely cost be to the United States itself?
Dave would probably have a better idea than I would, but it depends on a lot of factors. I don't know where they would go. It depends on what our security requirements are around the world. It depends on whether we can take them back into the U.S. It depends on other allies and what their needs might be. I'd say that there's an assumption that we can just we have 1.4 million troops in the world, the assumption that we can just take them out and bring them back into the U.S., but it's not that easy because sometimes it's easier to pay for the troops with our posture abroad because we have host nation support from other countries. So when Korea and Japan pay their share of non-personnel stationing costs, that is incredibly helpful. Instead of us bringing back, X thousand numbers of troops, and we're paying for all of the stationing and other costs as well.
Well, to give you just the anecdote, in 2004, when Secretary Rumsfeld withdrew a brigade combat team from the Western Corridor, that brigade combat team went from Korea to Iraq, served a year in Iraq, and then it came back and was dispersed throughout the U.S. military at Fort Carson, Fort Campbell, and basically the flags of those units, which we call, how we designate the units, those headquarters and those units dissolved. And we lost that force structure. The numbers were absorbed into the military, but we reduced by one brigade combat team that was a coherent, cohesive unit. And the reason for that is because it's very hard to absorb an entire unit like that back in the States. Everybody's familiar with BRAC, the Base Realignment Commission, and how our military bases are sized now to be able to host the military units that are there. And so to bring in another brigade combat team or two, or an aviation brigade or two air wings that are in Osan and Kunsan, that's going to require a lot of U.S. taxpayer money to build facilities in the United States to be able to house them. And so what normally will happen is, and this happened during the drawdown in Europe as well, units drew down and they were deactivated or inactivated. The flags were rolled up and the soldiers were farmed out throughout the rest of the military to make up other shortfalls. And so the size of our military will shrink because, as Frank said, it is cost effective in many ways for us to have the stationing costs, the non-personnel stationing costs, borne by the host nation. And I think in Korea, they're negotiating the burden sharing, the special measures agreement right now as we speak, and they pay about 46% of those costs, which that's 46% of U.S. taxpayers not having to foot that bill.
All right, I'd like to take and open to questions. Please wait for the microphone, and then if you could give your name and affiliation here in the front. Up here in the front.
Hi, thank you for this event. My name is Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. So there's been a lot of focus here in Washington about what the Trump administration's policy is toward North Korea negotiations. But there's also been some divergence in South Korea as to what its policy is regarding the future of U.S. forces in the Korean Peninsula. You'll all recall the Foreign Affairs article recently by Moon's National Security Advisor that suggested that it would be inevitable that U.S. forces would draw down conservatives in the opposition right now. They're in the bit of a wilderness, but there's a chance they could come back to power. How important do you think it is for the liberal Moon government to be making entreaties to the conservatives in the opposition to kind of come to some kind of compromised national security posture so that if in the event the conservatives come back to power, there isn't a backlash the way there was when President Lee was elected and he tore up the Sunshine Policy, and that was a contributing factor to the North Korea nuclearization push?
I think you're seeing sort of a sea change in South Korean policy so that it's not just the liberals, but even someone like Chun Young-woo, the National Security Advisor under Lee Myung-bak, who also talked about the need to consider the U.S. presence in Korea. And I think certainly President Moon is taking steps to, if not institutionalize, create a stronger foundation for some of the changes that will happen in the current inter-Korean negotiations and the USDPRK negotiations, including trying to get legislative approval for the Panmunjom Declaration. So I think you're seeing many different segments of South Korean society trying to push forth these efforts.
I hope I debunked Moon Chung-in's argument that said, if there is a peace regime, that there'll be no more justification for U.S. force presence. The Mutual Defense Treaty, again, doesn't specify the threat being only North Korea. And so the justification for U.S. forces, continued U.S. forces, is really going to be based on the agreement by both governments. Both governments have to agree. If the South Korean government does not want U.S. forces on the peninsula, we will pack up and go home, just as we've done in Iraq and anywhere else. I mean, that's. I heard Chuck Downs say on this stage about a week ago, the one thing that the U.S. government is very good at, if we're told to leave, we leave. Now, I think if we leave, that will have long-term implications. But I think Moon Chung-in's rationale, his argument, I think doesn't hold water if you read the Mutual Defense Treaty. And because there can be continued justification if there is a peace regime. It really depends on what the Korean and U.S. political leaders want to do. Now, that said, I think that continued evolution of the presence, determining capabilities based on our interests, on assessment of potential threats, is a good thing. And so I am not at all arguing that we should maintain the status quo. We've never maintained the status quo. There's been a continual evolution. As Frank said, we've gone from very large to lesser numbers. But we should determine what it is that the ROK-US alliance wants to achieve. We need to have a common assessment of the threats and then a common understanding of the contributions that each country can make to the security environment to support the ROK-US alliance.
I would just add that we talked earlier about the legislation, the amendment in FY 18-19 NDA about putting a floor of 22,000. So I think Representative Gallego's amendment is a little strange because it's not just up to the U.S. to put a floor on the presence of troops in Korea. It would require a discussion between both sides.
Yeah. And I mean, one other thing I think to keep in mind when we talk about the future is, the Cold War ended and we still have troops in the United Kingdom. We still have troops in Germany. We still have naval facilities in Italy. Some of this is because, and this is sort of the basis of my question of the relationship, relationships evolved, and you still want to have cooperation on these things.
Read the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy. I think they make the case that we still need to maintain forward presence.
Larry?
Larry Nitch from ICAS and
If you
CSIS.
could just put the mic near, thanks.
In 1998, the Clinton administration began four-party talks about a Korean peace treaty. I went to the State Department for a briefing at the beginning of those talks, and I asked the Director of Korean Affairs who presided over the meeting, what was the thinking in the State Department and the administration over how to negotiate over U.S. troops in negotiating over a Korean peace treaty. His answer flabbergasted me. He said, and I can quote, "We haven't thought much about that." It seems to me if we go into this kind of substantive nuclear negotiation that we've been talking about today, we're going to have to think very, very clearly about that. I certainly expect either at the summit or at the beginning of any subsequent nuclear talks that North Korea is going to press for early agreements and commitments from the U.S. to start a process of limiting the operations and exercises of U.S. forces in South Korea and offshore of South Korea. That's going to raise the question, perhaps as early as the summit, but subsequently certainly, what should our response be to that? Do we agree to that? Or do we basically tell the North that there will have to be certain steps taken in terms of agreements and implementation regarding denuclearization before we could begin to talk about U.S. troops? Or you might say U.S. troops are off the table completely in a denuclearization negotiation. What kind of thinking do you think we ought to start doing about this? Because I think this is very crucial. Chris Hill has related that Kim Gi-gwan told him throughout his talks with Kim Gi-gwan, you Americans eventually are going to have to come to terms with the issue of U.S. troops with us. And I think that time is about here.
Well, first of all, as a military person, I don't think we can sacrifice readiness. We have to maintain the ROK U.S. readiness of forces, the military capabilities. I would not make any changes in U.S. force status contingent on North Korea's nuclear status and on the dismantlement, but they could be discussed as part of confidence-building measures for conventional forces. And I think that you really get at the fundamental dilemma that really is almost a gamble. Do you trust North Korea, to not attack the South so that you can withdraw U.S. forces? I mean, that's really what you are asking to do. Because I think we all know, and you go back to, in Hwang Jung-yap in 1997 when he defected, the reason that North Korea never reinitiated hostilities is because of the U.S. presence, and that they could not win a war as long as the United States was supporting the ROK. And so I think that our deterrence works. And of course, Lawrence Friedman said deterrence works until it doesn't, but it has worked. And so, the withdrawal of U.S. forces has to be contingent on there not being a serious threat to the ROK. And so, to me, and from my military perspective, as long as North Korea presents a threat to the ROK, we can change U.S. forces, we can develop other capabilities, but we cannot break the alliance. And I think that we need to maintain the right kind of presence as long as there is a threat from the North. And I would not trade away that presence for dismantlement of its nuclear weapons, because that could leave South Korea extremely vulnerable to North Korea's conventional military in an attack.
Were you referring to Charles Cartman? Okay, my recollection of
I'm not going to mention
Okay.
who the office director was at the time.
My recollection of the four-party talks is that in Geneva, it basically fell apart because of one of the issues was the issue of withdrawal of U.S. forces. I agree with Dave, and just kind of broadening it, I feel like I'm of two minds on this, which is when do we sort of lay on the table everything that we're willing to concede? And I feel like that's something that's been missing in the discussion in the media, but also sort of internally from the people I talk to. We're always sort of thinking about what do we need to get North Korea to declare or be willing to give up, and we're less willing to talk about what the U.S. side is willing to concede. I think, in my mind, I feel like it would be worthwhile to lay out everything that we're willing to consider, perhaps even including a modification to force presence, a modification to exercises. But again, this is all contingent on steps that North Korea will take too. Some people see a disadvantage to that, not putting things on the table. I feel like North Korea needs to know what they may ultimately get in return for steps that they take.
All right, so we've only got about 5 minutes left. I'll take two last questions real quick. John here in the back.
John Burton with the Korea Times. But do you think that the ROK forces could defeat North Korea on its own if there was ever another attack?
Dave, let me get the last one. And then the gentleman here in the next to last row has been waiting patiently for a while.
Ken Meyercord, TV producer. Were we to withdraw our forces from the Korean Peninsula, what would be the impact in the event of a war with China? And to isolate that issue, let's suppose that the two Koreas or a unified Korea opted to remain neutral in the case of such a war.
Well, to the first question, my professional military judgment is that South Korea would defeat North Korea in any war. The problem is that the cost in blood and treasure will be immense. And so I believe that we don't want to see that happen. We don't want to see another war, North and South, or another war that has the Iraq-U.S. alliance against the North. And I believe that it is the Iraq-U.S. alliance that gives us the best chance to deter war. But if there are no forces on the Korean Peninsula, I have no doubt that the South Korean military is capable and they will prevail. But again, the Koreans living in the South and the North and the entire region will suffer immensely if there is a war. South Korea will prevail.
Are you talking about only in the sense of a conventional war, or?
Oh, even I think in a nuclear war. I think I don't think and I think that I think North Korea will be less inclined to use nuclear weapons if there are no external forces. They won't believe. I mean, I think that the use of nuclear weapons by North Korea in a war is going to be to deny access to bases for reinforcing forces, whether in South Korea and Busan or the 7 UN bases in Japan. I think those are the most likely targets for North Korean nuclear weapons. And if there is not an alliance between South Korea and the U.S., I think that North Korea would believe that they would want to fight a conventional war and not use nuclear weapons.
Any thoughts on this question about the conflict with China?
I'm very hesitant to answer that one just because there's so many. First of all, it's a very horrific scenario, but there's so many variables involved. I think one that you pose is if U.S. troops aren't on the Korean Peninsula, but it depends on where they go, what type of wars, what the alliance relationships are. That's just a difficult question to answer, I think.
Yeah, whoever said the first rule of war fighting is don't fight a land war or a war on the Asian landmass. We're already violating that in Korea, but I do not want to see a war with China on the Asian landmass.
Okay, well, we have a couple of minutes, so if there's maybe one last question. All right, the gentleman here in the front.
No need for.
Wait. Yeah.
My name's Todd Wiggins. Good afternoon. I'd like to end with a positive note. Can we do that?
Okay.
Sure.
All right. Good. So let's say in 20 years, give us 20 years for our kids to grow up and so on, that in some certain period of time that there is some kind of amicable, developed relationship between North and South Korea, perceivable that there might be one government and a leader that both the U.S. and Chinese can agree on. And I know that sounds la-di-da, but let's say that does happen. I'm hoping that the price of Samsung phones doesn't increase too much because I'm really counting on that. So can you imagine that scenario where we just stay parked and nothing bad happens and we end up benefiting from it mutually?
Well, I actually think that that's what we should be striving for. And in fact, if you go back to 2009, the joint vision statement between President Lee and President Obama, reaffirmed again by President Park and President Obama, and President Trump and President Moon said last June 30th in their statement that the ultimate goal is peaceful unification. And to me, the ideal situation would be a unified peninsula that is secure, stable, non-nuclear, unified under a liberal constitutional form of government determined by the Korean people. It might sound something like a United Republic of Korea or UROC. And so I think that is something that we should be striving for because that is really the solution to the problem, is a peaceful unification. It's just so hard to achieve.
One thing I'd add is that if you had that situation and relative peace on the peninsula, you would hear growing calls within South Korea, but also probably from the U.S., China, and North Korea about withdrawal of forces, right? And there's different permutations of how that could look. It could be the current status quo scenario. It could be sort of a mid-level of forces similar to what we have in different European countries. It could be a rotational arrangement where we have forces coming in and out, where we have access like in Thailand or Singapore. So there's different versions and permutations of what our presence could look like depending on the security environment and the mission required.
All right, well, on that note, this has been a really great conversation. Thank you both, and if you'll join me in thanking Frank and Dave. Thank you.
Good discussion.